Okay, yeah, thanks, Ruby. That's great. And now I'm going to introduce you to Kali Akuno from Jackson, Mississippi Corporation, Jackson. Hey, Kali.
Greetings, everybody. You have to forgive me. My back has been bothering me really bad, so I'm on this sitting setup, which makes it a little bit more comfortable. But it's been a pleasure to listen and learn so far. So should I just go into? Okay, all right. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I've been trying the last 2 days to figure out what really can be crammed into 15 minutes since there's a lot. So this is kind of what I've settled on, I think, to try and share, to add some kind of a deeper value from our experience, to kind of build onto the subject. And one critical thing I think I'd like to add is how our program and our vision has really been in response to kind of a series of structural crises. And we were very deliberately and intentionally built on that. Now, the first one that we were really responding to in a concrete sense. Now, this is not to say that there's not decades, if not centuries, of traditions and models around Black cooperatives, Black efforts at mutual aid that we are built upon. They are, but more specifically, we were built in part to kind of respond to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and the lessons that we had learned in Mississippi and Louisiana about the government's lack of a response and very intentional and kind of benign neglect towards so many communities, and particularly towards Black, Vietnamese, and Indigenous people, and Latinos and migrant workers in those areas. So we really tried to design a program that would build the community's capacity to kind of serve as many of its own material and social needs as possible, while at the same time not letting the government off the hook for its obligations and responsibilities, but not learning from Katrina that we don't want to be totally dependent upon the government, because it could very easily, as was demonstrated there, choose to overlook its responsibilities and look the other way and just enable the suffering, not just allow, but enable the suffering of many people. So building up our own kind of productive institutions, to deal with food, to deal with housing, in some cases to deal with transportation, to deal with healthcare. These became kind of front and center in what our model was built upon. Now we've been prepared in many respects on the basis of that practice for a new set of crises that have emerged for us in our locality. One, there's been adjusting to COVID, which has radically changed so many things in our community, and I think in many respects is going to change on a permanent basis, despite this great rush from all the politicians and all the kind of mainstream businesses to get quote unquote back to normal as soon as possible, regardless of the health and the consequences of the community. So really adjusting to this reality. And then in our case, we just recently suffered in February a historic freeze throughout most of the southwestern portion of the United States. These polar vortex came down, and basically from Texas all the way to Georgia, there was just a massive freeze for 3 weeks, which is unprecedented for that far in the deep South, where you have freezing temperatures that held consistent for that long. most of the infrastructure in the South, but particularly in Jackson, was not built with that type of kind of climate reality in mind. And in our case, it really just destroyed, and I do mean this little, destroyed much of our city's water delivery infrastructure, most of which was old and antiquated to begin with. A lot of it being lead pipes, which were placed down, some of it in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So it just really crippled that in our city. After these 3 weeks of freezing cold, then spent a month trying to get the water pressure and the water filtration back in operation. So this went on well into early April. And to this day, the city still hasn't fully adjusted to this kind of new situation. It's just kind of ad hoc fixes here and there. And we are, one of the ways in which we've adapted and adjusted is actually conducting a water delivery and a mutual aid delivery program every other Friday, because the need is still so great, including for water, drinkable and portable water, because you just cannot get, clean water or trustworthy water in the city. So much the boil notices that come from the city means sometimes you can't even bathe in it. This is the reality of where our infrastructure is at and where the state's kind of capacity is at. And I put this really on the state, not on the municipality. Let me be clear about that. The municipality has been trying to address this challenge for many a year, because this is not something that's particularly new. It's just being aggravated in the scales, I think, of it being kind of held in a stasis of semi-repair. Like, that's totally just been altered. The main problem that we have is an ultra-conservative state government, which will block federal funding on many cases. Like in our case, our governor is one of these who's kind of taken the lead as part of kind of the new right-wing movement in the United States on denying federal benefits, so that folks can't continue to get unemployment, even though the pandemic is far from over in Mississippi. And even though there's no child care for many people, particularly women, to re-enter into the workforce, because the systems just haven't been rebuilt. And in many cases in our community, they were inadequate to begin with. So, dealing with this new reality is a piece that we are now trying to respond to, kind of a post-COVID dynamic, and now this kind of new infrastructure dynamic. And what it speaks to, I think, is continues to address is the, dare I say it, that we were correct in our assessment some 15 years ago, that we kind of had to follow this outside inside model of community development and developing economic democracy from below. But we are now faced with some even greater challenges because of the post-COVID-19 and this new response. And it's very clear to us at this particular point in time that we are going to have to mobilize our community on a new level to build a new type of infrastructure to deal with the basic needs around water and around energy in our community. And you're doing this in a community which is already extremely impoverished. So we're just coming up with the most innovative ways that you can think of, which in some respects are getting some support from the municipality, even though they kind of go in the face of all the different types of regulations that are established by the state and federal government, because it sees directly for itself that people's needs have to be met, even if there's not the direct capacity of the municipal instrument to kind of follow through on it within the accordance of the kind of established law. So there's one set of dynamics where we know now very specifically this next 4 years, if not the next decade, is cultivating kind of a national level responsive coalition to really deal with the deep infrastructure crisis. And this is already beginning to emerge, not necessarily in the way that we would frame it, but you hear a lot of this already in Biden's presentation around this new infrastructure bill, where there's this tremendous debate that he's beginning to have with the Republicans over what is the definition of infrastructure, right? Because I think he's rightly so, and his advisors are rightly so, really pointing to that there's a new type of infrastructure to meet the 21st century and the broad comprehensive needs that has to be developed for everybody. Now they're developing it, unfortunately, with a dynamic of competition, particularly with China in mind, and not one which is fundamentally centered on meeting human needs. And those two things kind of go in opposite directions. So ours is, how do we develop these to meet the human needs in our community? And how do we do so in a way that we ensure that what is produced, it remains in the common space, not something that's privately appropriated or so state controlled and regulated as to then reinforce all the existing dynamics and inequalities. So for us, we're talking about building an autonomous infrastructure. And one of the key pieces that we've been working on as hard as diligently as we can over the past 2 months is really building up our own capacity on our community land trust, which is one of the key institutions, I would say right now, really the cornerstone institution of Cooperation Jackson, is building out our capacity to have our own water storage and our own energy utility in the form of kind of a solar farm on it. And we've already made some pretty significant headway just in the past 2 months of mobilizing the community, drawing resources directly from the community to be able to build up this capacity. So we think this is, in many respects, a new vision of the future and a new set of practices that we're going to have to adopt to address really the crumbling infrastructure that exists within the United States, which, given the political dynamic, we don't see being repaired through the kind of standard political process anytime soon. And we don't, I mean, that is a challenge within itself, don't get me wrong, but it also presents more opportunity, because as a result, we see more people having to become directly engaged in the direct governance questions in their community in a way that, kind of when the state has just been able to provide services without people kind of thinking about it or thinking that they were natural and normal, really kind of left it just kind of to an agency out there, as opposed to how do we develop our own agencies and capacities. So this side of it is really deepening the democratic practice in our community. We've seen a major kind of upturn from where we were at just 3 or 4 months ago. And now, granted, a lot of things slowed down because of COVID, but even, I would say, even compared to where we were pre-COVID, the level of democratic engagement in our community has gone up. And this is one of, Jackson has been, I would say, over the course of the last 15 years, really a high point of even pre-COVID, the level of community engagement, particularly through our people's assemblies and things of that nature, where there was a high level of engagement. Well, that's gone up pretty significantly in the past 2 months. And now I think the challenge is, how do we translate this into a set of common institutions that everybody can buy into and see working in development that we can sustain in the long haul. Because we all know that in times of crisis, folks need kind of immediate need. Times the things that address the systemic issues that lay beneath that take many years, if not decades, to kind of build out and be able to address. So this is one of the kind of creative tensions that we are aware of and trying to get ahead of to the best of our ability. But really looking forward to the challenge, because I think in our case, I would be remiss in saying that we have some great concerns about the future, not only of Mississippi, but the United States, because of the growing strength of the right. In particular, even though one would think that after what happened on January 6th, that Trump and many of the forces that support him would have become weaker politically, when in fact they're becoming more consolidated and stronger on the basis of what happened. So this is a major counterpoint that we have to organize for. So seeing this kind of mass engagement is a real encouraging sign around the energy, particularly from the Ford Rebellion, not waning, but being sustained, and I think moving us to a higher place of kind of internal development and self-sustainability. Now, the issue is, when and how is this going to clash? Because we know inevitably there's going to be some clash between these two set of forces. And do we have enough time to get prepared in the face of what the right historically in the United States has been willing to do, which is commit, tremendous acts of violence, particularly against Black, Latino, Indigenous peoples, people that have been othered in some way. Do we have enough time to build up our capacity to be able to both deal with that, and more importantly, I think, to move some of the critical sectors of kind of the white working class to a new practice and a new orientation? Like, that is something we can't overlook, and we think us gaining in strength and being able to build these kind of alternatives, which we can demonstrate that our communities are on their own effort, building a better quality of life. We believe this could move many of the critical poor white communities, which live oftentimes very adjacent to us, move them in some dynamic ways that takes them out of the influence of many of these right-wing forces. So this is a part of our challenge that we are welcoming in many respects, because we see that things could either go horribly wrong or they could be very transformative, and it's just really a pivot between the two, and it's very clear which one we're aiming for and what we're trying to build through our efforts and activities. So I would encourage everybody to stay tuned and stay connected, because we're all going to need each other on an international basis to make this work.
Thank you, Kali. Yeah, I can really feel that. I just a question from me before we go to the ones in the chat, and just the level of resources you're able to mobilize in your community. Are they, obviously there's financial and kind of people's own time and labor and that kind of thing. Is there anything coming from the municipality or the state at all to you?
In direct aid, no. In indirect aid, plenty, right? So I mean, we've also, just to be clear, we've adopted, this is Cooperation Jackson, we've adopted a kind of a principle that we haven't directly requested, funds or resources from the municipality, right? And that is kind of based upon a practice and a politic that one, we are trying to break. Let me just be very clear and explicit. We are trying to break a very particular dynamic in our city and many cities, many particularly Black-led cities, where there's kind of a particular class that gets cultivated to dominate the resources of the municipality through contracting mechanisms, right? Where there's the kind of a Black political class which owns and dominates that process and dynamic in a totally undemocratic way. And for us, since there's an administration which is very close to us, we also have many differences with them, politically, but they are our old friends, our old comrades. We know them well. We helped them get into office several times now. I used to work actually for the municipality to try to implement this program. That we've been trying to build up the resources and capacity outside of that to not fall into this kind of patronage model, but also to stay away from the kind of politics of people thinking that because these are our friends that we're getting kickbacks and things of that nature, right? Which is a real thing in many places in our area. And we're trying to be value added to the overall municipality by bringing in more resources than we're extracting from the municipality. That's a very clear and explicit thing for us. But what the municipality does do is give us permission to move and utilize a lot of public resources, public lands in particular, to augment, what we're doing for farming and things of that nature. So making the space available where the ownership necessarily hasn't been transformed, but we say, hey, we want to put this, since it's not being used in productive capacity, to get somebody to farm it. Can we get an agreement from you to do that for 3 years or 5 years, whatever the case may be? And that the municipality, things like that, the municipality gives a great amount of support to, which is just opens up. And part of why we even pursued our particular brand of municipalism was to recognize that the state is a limited instrument from our perspective, but what we needed and wanted to do was open up space for the social movements to be able to build their own capacity to act in a self-determined way. And I think our municipality has done a great job of that in many respects. And it has to, because it recognizes that it doesn't have, the resources. So like one of the big challenges for us, just so everybody is clear, we know there's a major battle now that's going to happen about the privatization of our water system. But here's the challenge, is that even though this is being pushed by the state and by numerous capital forces for well over a decade now, they now have the upper hand, I think, because of this, recent catastrophe. But here's the issue, private capital wants to come in and gut what exists. Well, what we have is there's really nothing to gut because there's very little there. Well, we also know that they're not going to put in, 10 to $15 billion to repair the system, right? And so if the state doesn't provide those resources, what are they going to privatize in essence? Because they're not going to build that capacity, only to maybe lose it if it could be remunicipalized down the road. So we are now looking at this kind of uncertain future where it's too broke for them to privatize since they're not going to invest in it, but it doesn't meet our needs. So how do we fill the gaps? And so the municipality right now, I think, is in the space of, trying to figure this all out with us and with many other players in the community, and we'll see what happens in that regard.
Thank you. And one of the questions is that, do you think it's easier to get a lot of people involved when they're fearful or think the government doesn't care, or and I'm just adding to that to wonder whether actually they're inspired by what you're doing as well? So that's also a call to action.
Inspired, but let me be clear that particularly the Black community has had in Mississippi, like throughout most of the United States, but particularly in Mississippi, the Black community is fairly used to having to do a number of critical things on its own because it's not going to get and has never received the resources from the state government as other communities have. And so folks, are already in many respects very self-reliant. And I think what we are adding to that is, rather than kind of an individual or family-based self-reliance, a communal and collective self-reliance. And I think that is becoming more and more inspiring to folks to know that they can pull together beyond just their family unit and rely on a broader set of networks and resources and people in the community, to draw from. I think that is where what we've been doing, particularly with the water distribution stuff, we've seen that just grow by leaps and bounds, that like, oh, there's other people caring, there's other people doing this, and we found folks who've added on to us, like they were just, maybe someone who had some additional income was providing water for folks on their block. They've now joined, and there's about 10 folks who were doing that in their community, or like on their street, who've now added on to us and are part of our funding pool and part of our resource bank of folks who are helping to distribute it. So we've seen that type of activity, I think, really increase, which has been deeply encouraging as kind of a countermeasure to many of the things that the messaging that was coming out from COVID, at least in Mississippi, which is basically don't ask the state for anything because we're not going to provide for anything, and you're basically on your own. Your healthcare is on your own, your own well-being is on your own. So folks coming together with a counter practice and a counter narrative, I think, and buying into it in the face of that kind of orientation, to me, has been very beautiful.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. And just one last question before we close with talking to you about this particular kind of bit. Are you kind of standalone pioneers, or do you work as part of a broader network?
Broader network. I mean, we couldn't do what we do without a broader network. We just don't have, I mean, we have a nice size base, but to try to do everything, would take thousands of people to do. And we aren't there yet, but we also, we're also pushing back against this model that like one organization that has to have thousands of people. I mean, it would be nice. I wouldn't, bet against it in some respects, but there's also a kind of a new politics of federation that has really grown in the United States, where people can kind of reserve their autonomy and come in and come out when they so choose, and how they align. And that's something that resonates with us, particularly it's allowed us a great deal of flexibility when, particularly given sometimes the very hostile politics in Mississippi.
Oh, I was hoping that might be a glitch. Okay, maybe we can hold that thought until the final session with the Q&As, and hope Kali can join us again.